I ignored her prying eyes, ignored her lies, ignored being called a stranger in my own house. But when she stood in the middle of the street, pointed her finger at my wife and called the police because she didn't open the door, that was no longer an insult. It was a declaration of war. She thought my wife was a gentle person who would silently endure, would stay silent for fear of trouble. But she was wrong, very wrong. Because as soon as the 3 police cars stopped in front of the gate, that was when we decided we wouldn't just protest, we would overthrow the throne that she thought no one would dare touch. My wife and I had just moved to Millbrook 3 months earlier, looking for a quiet place to live. My wife was a quiet, unassuming woman who rarely talked about her work, beyond vague references to coordinating with law enforcement. I was David Mitchell, 37, a data analyst for a mid-size insurance company. What we didn't expect was to live next door to Karen Whitman, 38, the self-proclaimed queen of Pine Valley. Karen ran the HOA like a military regime, using the rulebook as a weapon and intimidation as her strategy. Within the first week, we had become her favorite targets. But what Karen didn't realize was that betraying my wife wasn't just a mistake. It was the beginning of her downfall. The whole nightmare started over something completely ridiculous. Our car was parked exactly 2 inches too close to the curb. I'm not exaggerating, I actually measured it myself with a ruler I'd bought specifically for this purpose. The next morning, a $200 citation appeared on our windshield with bold red lettering. Violation of Ordinance 15.3, minus improper parking line. Sarah stared at the ticket through sleepy eyes and asked, "What the hell is Ordinance 15.3? I spent the next hour digging through the 200-page HOA manual that Karen had personally delivered to our door on moving day. Finally found it buried in the appendix. All vehicles must maintain a minimum distance of 3 inches from the curb, maximum 6 inches. This brilliant new rule had been implemented exactly 1 week ago, conveniently, right after we moved in. David, Sarah said quietly, studying the citation with unusual intensity. This seems oddly specific. She pulled out a small leather notebook and started writing down details. Who enforces something like this? I shrugged, still in disbelief. Apparently our friendly neighborhood dictator does. The first week of Karen's campaign felt like psychological warfare designed to break our spirits. Every morning at exactly 7 a.m. she would appear outside our house with a measuring tape and professional-grade camera, documenting every microscopic detail of our parking job. She'd mutter loudly enough for us to hear through the windows. 1.7 inches, clearly intentional disrespect. Then she'd take photos from multiple angles like she was documenting a crime scene. Sarah tried to brush it off initially, but I could see the stress building in her shoulders. Her usual calm demeanor started showing cracks. "You okay, babe?" I asked one evening, finding her at the kitchen table surrounded by printed emails and that leather notebook. She looked up, pen still in hand, and said slowly, "David, I've never met anyone quite this persistent." The way she said it made me think she'd dealt with difficult people before, in whatever job she did. But Karen was apparently in a league of her own. She sent 43 emails in 5 days, Sarah continued, showing me printed copies, to every resident in the neighborhood. Look at this subject line. Urgent, new residents threaten community standards. I read over her shoulder, amazed at the dramatic language Karen used. It was like she was reporting a national emergency instead of a parking dispute. Karen didn't stop with daily surveillance and email campaigns. She escalated to what I can only describe as propaganda warfare. The emails grew more elaborate, including photo evidence of our violations with dramatic red arrows pointing to the supposed infractions and detailed measurements written in angry block letters. I started getting awkward looks from neighbors at the mailbox, and Mrs. Stevens from down the street actually crossed to the other side of the road to avoid talking to me. "This is insane," I told Sarah one morning after finding another citation on our windshield. "She's treating us like public enemies over parking." Sarah was reading through what looked like legal documents at the breakfast table. "David," she said without looking up, "some people use power because they can, not because they should." There was something in her tone that suggested personal experience with this kind of abuse. Week 2 escalated to public humiliation on a scale I couldn't have imagined. Karen called an emergency HOA meeting and projected massive photos of our car onto the community center screen. 30 pairs of eyes stared at us like we were hardened criminals appearing before a tribunal. The community center felt more like a courtroom, with Karen playing prosecutor, judge, and jury all at once. "The Mitchell family," Karen announced with theatrical flair, pointing a laser pointer at the screen, "has violated parking regulations 15 times in 10 days. They show blatant disrespect for lawfully elected HOA authority and are negatively impacting all of our property values." She clicked through slide after slide of our car, each one marked with measurements and violation timestamps. It was impressively thorough in its pettiness. An elderly neighbor named Jim Bradley raised his hand and said, "Karen, their car looks perfectly normal to me. I've been watching them and they seem like nice folks." Karen's voice got sharper. "Normal? Look at this measurement, 1.8 inches from the curb. The minimum legal distance is 3 inches. This is willful defiance of community standards." I noticed Sarah taking detailed notes in that leather journal again, but she remained completely silent throughout the entire presentation. Her expression was unreadable, but I could see her pen moving rapidly across the pages. When Karen asked if we had anything to say in our defense, Sarah simply looked up and said, "Not at this time." The calm in her voice was almost unsettling. By week 3, Karen's harassment became deeply personal and invasive in ways that felt borderline stalking. She started tracking our daily schedules with military precision and would coincidentally appear whenever Sarah left for work to verify compliance with community standards. Karen would stand at the end of our driveway with a clipboard, making notes about our comings and goings, like some kind of neighborhood surveillance officer. One afternoon, I came home to find Sarah standing in our driveway with tears in her eyes, the first time I'd ever seen this incredibly strong, composed woman show vulnerability. "What happened?" I asked, immediately concerned and ready to march over to Karen's house myself. "She told every neighbor on the block that I'm an illegal resident and that you married someone unworthy of living in this community," Sarah replied, her voice shaking with a mixture of hurt and anger. "She said what?" I felt my own anger rising to dangerous levels. "She actually used those words?" Sarah nodded, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. "She was standing right there by the mailboxes, talking to Mrs. Chen and Mr. Rodriguez, loud enough for everyone to hear. She said I was probably here illegally and that you were too stupid to realize you'd been tricked into marriage." But then Sarah wiped her eyes and said something that stuck with me. "David, some people don't understand where real power actually comes from." There was steel in her voice that I'd never heard before, and for a moment, she didn't sound like the quiet government worker I'd thought I'd married. She sounded like someone who'd been underestimated before and knew exactly how that story ended. Week 4 brought outright fabrication and extortion that crossed the line from harassment into criminal behavior. Karen accused us of vandalizing community property because of a crack in the sidewalk in front of our house. This crack had existed long before we moved in. I'd noticed it during our house hunting visits, but she presented photographic evidence, supposedly taken after our arrival, complete with timestamps and measurements. "You will pay $3,000 in repair costs," Karen declared at the second emergency meeting she'd called that month. She stood at the podium like a prosecutor delivering closing arguments. "This sidewalk was perfect before the Mitchells moved in. Now look at this damage." She projected photos of the crack from multiple angles, each one annotated with accusations about our destructive behavior. Sarah stood up for the first time during one of these meetings. The room fell silent as she rose from her chair with fluid, confident movement. "Are you absolutely certain you want to go down a legal path, Mrs. Whitman?" she asked, her voice carrying an authority that made everyone pay attention. Karen laughed dismissively and shot back, "What are you, some kind of lawyer or something?" Sarah smiled coldly, and for just a moment I saw something in her expression that made me realize I didn't know my wife as well as I thought I did. "No, but I understand the law better than you might think." The way she said it made Karen pause, studying Sarah's face like she was trying to solve a puzzle. Then Karen recovered her arrogance and declared, "I'm giving you until this weekend to pay up or I file a lawsuit." On Monday morning, that weekend, instead of paying Karen's extortion money, Sarah did something that surprised me. She spent hours at her laptop, printing documents and making phone calls to numbers I didn't recognize. "What are you working on?" I asked. "Research," she replied without looking up, making sure I understand all my options. When she finished, she'd filed an official complaint about systematic abuse of HOA authority and targeted harassment of residents with what she said was the appropriate oversight body. Karen's response was swift and vicious, like a wounded animal lashing out. She banned us from using any community amenities, the pool, the park, even the communal trash bins. She posted official-looking signs around the neighborhood stating, "Anyone who assists the Mitchell family in any way will face a $500 penalty for violation of HOA solidarity provisions." The level of petty tyranny was almost impressive in its thoroughness and vindictiveness. "She's lost her mind," I told Sarah as we read the latest proclamation. "This can't be legal." Sarah was reading through a stack of papers that looked suspiciously like legal statutes. "It's not," she said simply. "Not even close." Something in her tone made me ask, "How do you know so much about this stuff?" She looked up from the papers and said, "I've had to deal with people who abuse authority before. You learn to recognize the patterns." That's what led to the fateful Saturday morning when Karen came pounding on our door like a woman possessed. When I chose not to answer, she made what would turn out to be the most spectacularly stupid decision of her life. She called 911 and reported us for obstruction of government business and for failure to comply with lawful orders. 2 hours later, as those 3 police cruisers pulled up with Karen standing there in triumphant pose, everything was about to change. She had no idea that the quiet woman she'd been tormenting for a month was about to turn her entire world upside down. When our front door opened, Sarah stepped outside, wearing simple athletic clothes, her hair still damp from the shower. But something was different about her posture. Straighter, more commanding, with an unmistakable air of authority that seemed to fill the space around her. It was like watching someone put on invisible armor. The lead officer, a middle-aged sergeant with graying temples, approached with a serious expression. "We received a report about obstruction of official duties and failure to cooperate with local government representatives," he announced in the formal tone police use when they're not sure what they're dealing with. "Mrs. Dorothy Whitman claims you refused to open your door when she came to perform official HOA business." Karen stepped forward with that insufferable smirk. "That's exactly right. I am the legally elected HOA president. These people must follow community regulations." Sarah looked at Karen for exactly 1 second, then turned to the officer with professional courtesy. "Sergeant Peterson, isn't it?" she said, and I was struck by how different her voice sounded. Not louder, but carrying more weight somehow. The sergeant's eyebrows shot up in surprise. Yes, ma'am, but I don't believe we've been formally introduced." Sarah extended her hand professionally. "Sarah Chen. I think it's time we met properly." Sergeant Peterson stared at Sarah intently, and I watched his expression change from confusion to recognition to something approaching shock. His eyes suddenly widened. "Ma'am, I believe I know who you are now, but I want to be certain." "Is there a problem, Sergeant?" Sarah asked, her voice remaining gentle but carrying unmistakable weight that made everyone present pay attention. "No, ma'am, no problem at all," Peterson replied, his entire demeanor shifting towards something much more respectful. "Could I possibly see some identification?" he requested, glancing nervously between Sarah and the increasingly confused Karen. I was confused too. Why was this police sergeant treating my wife like she was someone important? Sarah pulled out her wallet and handed over an ID card without hesitation. Sergeant Peterson examined it carefully, and his entire demeanor changed instantly. His back straightened, his expression became formal, and he looked like a soldier who just realized he was talking to a commanding officer. "Sarah Chen, Chief of Police, Millbrook Township," he read aloud, then immediately snapped to attention. "Ma'am, Chief!" The 2 other officers heard this and immediately straightened up, offering respectful salutes. Karen stood there like she'd been struck by lightning. Her mouth opened and closed several times without sound, her face cycling through confusion, disbelief, and dawning horror. "What? What do you mean?" she finally stammered, looking between Sarah and the officers like someone had just told her the sky was green. Sarah smiled warmly at the officers, then turned to Karen with an expression of polite interest. "I'm Sarah Chen, the new Chief of Police for Millbrook Township. I started 3 months ago, but I prefer not to wear my uniform at home on weekends." The words hit Karen like physical blows. But you're just his wife," she sputtered desperately, pointing at me like I was evidence of some kind of fraud. "I'm absolutely David's wife," Sarah replied calmly, reaching over to squeeze my hand. "But Monday through Friday, I run the entire police department for this town. I oversee 43 officers, manage a budget of $12 million, and coordinate with state and federal law enforcement agencies. Each fact landed like a hammer blow on Karen's crumbling worldview. Sarah turned back to Sergeant Peterson with complete professionalism. "Sergeant, what's the situation report?" Peterson straightened even more if that was possible. "Ma'am, we received a 911 call from Mrs. Dorothy Whitman reporting obstruction of official duties. She claimed you and your husband refused to open your door when she came to perform what she called official government business." Sarah nodded thoughtfully, like she was processing information in a formal briefing. "Mrs. Whitman," she said, turning to face Karen directly, "do you possess any law enforcement authority or legal warrant that would require residents to open their doors?" Karen's face was getting redder by the second. "I'm the HOA president. I have rights. I have authority." "The HOA is not a law enforcement agency," Sarah stated firmly, her voice taking on the tone of someone who'd explained this concept many times before. "You only have authority to enforce civil contract obligations between neighbors. Calling 911 with false allegations of criminal activity could constitute filing a false police report, which is a misdemeanor in this state." Karen's face went completely pale. I didn't know you were—" "That doesn't change the law, Mrs. Whitman," Sarah interrupted smoothly. "Ignorance of someone's identity doesn't excuse filing false reports or misusing emergency services." The authority in her voice was unmistakable now, and I found myself seeing my wife in a completely new light. At that moment, our neighbor Jim Bradley walked over from across the street, probably drawn by the commotion of 3 police cars in our quiet neighborhood. "Excuse me, what's happening here?" he asked, looking concerned. Karen spun around, desperately, like a drowning person reaching for a life preserver. "Jim, finally, someone who stands for justice and order." But Jim shook his head, firmly, disappointing Karen completely. "Karen, I've been watching this whole week, and you've gone way too far. The Mitchell's car is parked perfectly fine. I've measured it myself out of curiosity." "Jim?" Karen gasped in shock, clearly not expecting this betrayal from someone she'd counted as an ally. "I've lived here for 20 years, Jim continued, his voice growing stronger. "I've never seen an HOA president issue fines for 2 inches of parking space. You're creating rules just to harass these folks, and everybody in the neighborhood knows it." Several other neighbors had started gathering at a respectful distance, drawn by the unusual sight of police cars, and clearly listening to every word. Sarah said calmly, "I've been researching our HOA regulations extensively, Sergeant Peterson. Mrs. Whitman has violated several local ordinances herself." She pulled out a thick folder that seemed to appear from nowhere. "First, Ordinance 15.3 was enacted without the required 30-day notice period mandated by state law. Second, she's engaged in systematic harassment and stalking of residents without legal basis. Third, banning residents from community amenities violates the original HOA contract that all residents signed when purchasing their homes." Karen stepped backward, looking like she was having trouble breathing. I was just doing my job. I was protecting property values." "Your job doesn't include abusing your position or violating state law," Sarah replied with steel in her voice. "And it certainly doesn't include calling 911 for personal revenge because residents won't submit to illegal harassment." Sergeant Peterson looked at Sarah respectfully. "Ma'am, do you want to press charges for filing a false report?" The question hung in the air like a sword over Karen's head. Karen looked absolutely terrified. "No, please, I didn't mean to. I didn't know." Sarah studied Karen for a long moment, and I could practically see her weighing options in her head. "I'll consider it," Sarah finally said. "But first, I want to address this HOA situation properly and legally." She turned to Jim and the gathered neighbors. "I propose we call an emergency HOA meeting for tomorrow night. There are serious issues that need immediate attention and resolution." But Sarah had no idea that Karen had been preparing one final, desperate gambit for exactly this kind of confrontation. Monday evening, the Pine Valley Community Center was packed beyond capacity. Word about the police chief versus the HOA president had spread like wildfire throughout the neighborhood and beyond. Not only were residents present, but local reporters from the Millbrook Gazette had shown up, along with several town officials, including a city councilman. The air was electric with anticipation, like the moments before a championship boxing match. Karen sat in the front row, dressed impeccably as always in her signature teal blazer, but her face showed the strain of 24 hours spent preparing for this battle. Her usual confident posture looked forced, and I noticed her hands shaking slightly as she organized papers on the table in front of her. Sarah and I took seats in the middle section, as calm as if we were attending a routine work meeting. Karen stood up first, projecting confidence she clearly didn't feel. Dear neighbours and friends, I called this meeting to address a serious problem that threatens the very foundation of our community. Her voice carried across the room with practiced authority. We have a resident who has abused her position to intimidate and threaten your lawfully elected HOA president. Murmurs rippled through the crowd as people leaned forward to hear better. Sarah Chen might be a police chief, Karen continued, gaining momentum, but she cannot use her badge to avoid community responsibilities that apply to every resident equally. The law is the law, and nobody is above it. She activated the projector with a dramatic flourish, displaying dozens of photos of our car from every conceivable angle. Here is systematic evidence of ongoing violations spanning 4 weeks. These people have shown complete disrespect for our community standards. She clicked through image after image, each one annotated with measurements and timestamps. And when I came to perform my legal duties as your elected president, they refused to cooperate and then threatened me with police action. Some neighbours nodded along, clearly influenced by Karen's presentation. Her confidence seemed to be returning as she saw support in the crowd. Are we going to let one person, regardless of their job, destroy the property values and community standards we've worked so hard to maintain? Several people actually applauded, and Karen's smile became genuine for the first time in days. Sarah stood up carrying a thick folder of documents that looked far more substantial than Karen's presentation materials. Thank you, Mrs. Whitman. I have some materials I'd like to present as well. She connected her laptop to the projection system with smooth, practiced movements that suggested she'd done this many times before. First, let's discuss Ordinance 15.3 regarding parking, Sarah began, her voice carrying easily through the room without seeming loud. The screen displayed legal text in clear, readable fonts. According to municipal law, all HOA regulation changes require 30 days advance notice to residents. Ordinance 15.3 was enacted on August 15th and took effect August 16th. This violates proper legal procedure. Elizabeth Murphy, a retired attorney in our neighbourhood, raised her hand immediately. Sarah is absolutely correct. That ordinance is legally invalid from the moment it was enacted. Karen jumped up, her carefully prepared confidence cracking. Those are just technicalities. The important thing is maintaining community standards. Law is built on technicalities, Mrs. Whitman, Sarah replied smoothly, and I have many more to discuss. Sarah clicked to the next slide with the precision of someone giving a professional briefing. My home security system recorded Mrs. Whitman's activities over the past 4 weeks. High-definition video footage appeared on screen showing Karen measuring our car with a tape measure, photographing from multiple angles, and even filming through our windows when we entered and exited the house. This constitutes systematic stalking and harassment under state law, Sarah explained as the footage continued. Mrs. Whitman visited our property 23 times in 4 weeks, including weekends and late evenings. She documented our personal schedules, photographed our vehicles and home, and shared this information with third parties without consent. The room watched in stunned silence as the crystal-clear evidence played out before them. Karen looked like she might faint. Second, Sarah continued, advancing to the next slide, regarding the sidewalk crack that Mrs. Whitman claims we caused. The screen showed a Google Street View image with a clear timestamp. This photograph of our neighbourhood was taken 2 years ago. You can clearly see the crack already existed exactly where it is today. Jim Bradley stood up and declared, I can confirm that crack has been there since at least 2019. I've been complaining to the city about it for years. More neighbours nodded in agreement, and I could see Karen's support evaporating in real time. Third, Sarah said, clicking to a new slide, let's discuss the real motivation behind these attacks. The screen displayed an organisational chart that made several people gasp. Mrs. Whitman isn't just our HOA president. She's also a paid representative of Pinnacle Development Corporation, the company that wants to buy out our entire neighbourhood for a luxury high-rise project. The room erupted in shocked whispers and angry murmurs. Their strategy was to make life so miserable here that residents would sell their homes below market value, Sarah continued as the noise died down. My family became the first target, because we're newcomers and supposedly easier to drive away. Karen shot to her feet, her face bright red with panic and rage. That's completely false. You have no proof. This is a desperate attempt to distract from your own violations. Actually, I do have proof, Sarah said with a slight smile that somehow managed to be both pleasant and terrifying. The screen displayed email correspondence, with headers clearly showing sender and recipient information. Email from Marcus Pinnacle to Mrs. Whitman, dated August 10th. Dorothy, we need to increase pressure on the new residents. $50,000 bonus for every house sold below market value. Focus on the newcomers first. They have the weakest community ties. The room fell dead silence, except for the sound of people shifting in their seats. And here's Mrs. Whitman's response, sent the same day. Sarah continued reading in a clear, steady voice. Target identified. The Mitchell family will serve as an example to the others. Beginning harassment campaign tomorrow. Karen collapsed into her chair, her face drained of all color and her hands visibly trembling. The smoking gun was undeniable, displayed in her own words for everyone to see. Jim Bradley stood up, his voice shaking with anger. Karen, you've been lying to all of us for months. You wanted to drive us out of our own homes. Susan Davis, the HOA vice president, shook her head in disgust. I can't believe this. We trusted you completely. We defended you. Another neighbor shouted from the back. You wanted to destroy our community for money. How much were they paying you? Karen tried to stand, attempting one last desperate defense. I only wanted what was best for the neighborhood, property values, community standards. By selling it to developers, Sarah asked coldly. Elizabeth Murphy rose to address the room with the authority of her legal background. I motion to remove Dorothy Whitman from the position of HOA president immediately for abuse of power, conflict of interest, and violation of fiduciary duty. Seconded, rang out from multiple voices simultaneously, the anger in the room now focused entirely on Karen. The vote was swift and decisive. 47 votes for removal, 0 votes in support, 3 abstentions from people who seemed too shocked to participate. Karen sat alone in the front row, completely isolated. Her reign of terror officially over. You'll all regret this decision, she whispered weakly, her voice barely audible. No, Sarah replied firmly, her voice carrying to every corner of the room. We're going to rebuild this community the right way, with transparency and respect for everyone's rights. The applause that followed was thunderous, and I realized that my wife had just become the most respected person in Pine Valley. But this public humiliation was only the beginning of Karen's consequences. The week following the meeting, Karen Whitman faced serious legal repercussions that made headlines in the local newspaper. The district attorney's office formally charged her with filing false police reports and abuse of public trust. The charges carried potential jail time and substantial fines, along with a permanent criminal record that would follow her everywhere. Pinnacle Development Corporation immediately severed all ties with her, issuing a public statement claiming they had no knowledge of Mrs. Whitman's individual actions and do not condone harassment of residents. They withdrew their development plans entirely and paid a $100,000 fine to the township for attempting to manipulate the local real estate market through intimidation. Karen and her husband Robert made the decision to leave Pine Valley after the social pressure became unbearable. Their house went on the market within days of the meeting and sold within 2 weeks for 15% below market value. Ironic justice considering her original scheme. Karma is absolutely real, Jim Bradley told me as we watched the final moving truck leave Karen's driveway. In the next HOA meeting, Jim Bradley was elected as interim president by unanimous vote. His first official act was establishing a regulatory reform committee, with Sarah serving as legal advisor. We need simple, fair and transparent rules, Sarah explained to the gathered residents. Regulations should serve the community, not create opportunities for harassment or personal profit. Within 1 month, the HOA handbook was reduced from 200 pages to 25 pages of clear, reasonable guidelines. Ridiculous rules like parking between 3 and 6 inches from the curb were completely eliminated. New regulations focused on maintaining green spaces, traffic safety, and organizing community events that brought neighbors together instead of driving them apart. Elizabeth Murphy, with her legal expertise, became the new vice president and took responsibility for ensuring all regulations complied with local and state laws. Never again, she declared at her first meeting, will this community allow power to be abused in such a way. The neighborhood atmosphere transformed completely over the following months. Neighbors, who had previously lived in fear of Karen's arbitrary enforcement, began interacting and helping each other again. Block parties returned, children played freely in the streets, and the sense of community that had been destroyed by fear was slowly rebuilt through trust and mutual respect. The Stevens family, who had been fined for planting wrong-colored flowers, now freely decorated their garden however they chose. Mrs. Stevens became close friends with Sarah, regularly inviting us over for tea and gardening advice. Their garden became a neighborhood showcase with vibrant colors that had been banned under Karen's regime. Mike Rodriguez, who had been banned from the pool for dress code violations, became a volunteer swimming instructor for neighborhood children. The pool area, once a source of stress and arbitrary rules, became the heart of community life again, filled with laughter and families enjoying themselves without fear. Sarah quickly became the most respected person in our community, not just as police chief, but as the person who liberated our neighborhood from tyranny. "I never thought I'd become a community hero," Sarah told me one evening as we sat on our porch watching children play in the street without fear of noise violations. "You've always been my hero," I replied, squeezing her hand. "Now everyone else knows it too." She smiled, but I could see she was still processing the dramatic change in how our neighbors viewed her. From quiet newcomer to neighborhood savior in just a few months. 6 months later, Pine Valley became the model neighborhood of Millbrook Township. Property values increased 20%, not because of fear-based enforcement, but because people genuinely wanted to live in a community known for fairness and respect. Real estate agents specifically marketed homes here as being in the neighborhood, with the famous reformed HOA. The story of HOA Karen versus Police Chief Sarah became local legend, retold at town meetings as an example of justice triumphing over abuse of power. Sarah received the mayor's Outstanding Citizen of the Year award, not just for her police work, but for contributing to community harmony and demonstrating leadership under pressure. 1 year after the incident, the neighborhood decided to install a bronze plaque at the Pine Valley entrance that would commemorate the transformation. It reads, "Pine Valley Community, established 1987, where justice and conscience always prevail, reformed 2024. Below that, in smaller text, funded by Pinnacle Development penalty fees. Every time I pass that plaque, I remember Karen and the lesson she taught all of us. Real power doesn't come from titles or money, but from earning respect and trust from your community. Authority without accountability becomes tyranny, but true leadership brings out the best in everyone." Tonight, as I finish this story, Sarah is in our garden, watering the flowers Mrs. Stevens gave us. Not regulation white flowers, but colourful blooms that grow freely in every direction, representing the beauty that emerges when fear is replaced with freedom. From the kitchen, I can hear children laughing in the park, sounds that had been banned for months as too noisy, but now represent the joy of a healthy community. That's the sound of freedom. Some people are born to rule through fear, using whatever small power they can grab to make others miserable. But others are born to protect justice, to stand up for those who can't protect themselves, and to ensure that power serves people instead of the other way round. Karen thought she was dealing with an ordinary suburban couple who would eventually break under pressure and flee. She never imagined she was challenging the one person who actually held real authority and knew exactly how to use it properly. And that miscalculation became the biggest mistake of her entire life, teaching everyone in Pine Valley what happens when bullies finally meet someone stronger than they are.